Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video I'm back with another of my 20-year anniversary retrospectives for Big Brother, this time talking about Big Brother 4. A season that I remember not liking back in the day. I mean, even when I first started this channel, I had this ranked at the bottom of my Big Brother season rankings, obviously outside of season 1. But in time since then, I've already rewatched this season, which had already boosted my opinion of the season coming into my latest rewatch here, to the point where I will say I do genuinely enjoy this season. Now, at the end of the day, it's still in the bottom half of my rankings, but I definitely have a lot more respect for this season than I previously had. Where, while the bulk of this season does surround this heavy-handed theme of the X Factor, and the cast of this season is downright middling and unlikable for the most part, seemingly due to the theme, where despite the fact that there are these two massive standouts that really excel this season, and also end up evolving the strategy of the game, though there are obviously these two massive standouts that really excel this season, and also end up evolving the strategy of the game, this commonly being noted as the starting point of the floater strategy, and certainly ends up being the first time we see it being used effectively between two sides. So again, there is merit to this season, despite it having a number of downsides. But to talk through it, I'll be running through the season from beginning to end, starting off with the premiere, which starts off with a similar structure to that of the previous two seasons, with this old school style of intro and seeing the players getting their keys with their dumb one-liners, during which we do see all 13 players here, which I should mention, this ends up being the largest BBUS cast up to this point, and here we do get a number of notable moments, like G calling himself an international player. We also get Jack revealing that he was in the FBI, which I'm sure will never be mentioned ever again. Also, we get a lot of talk about sex here, because this is still in the era of the show where they're still buying into this sex sales mentality. The most notable example of this being David asking if sex is allowed, which finally this is followed by them cutting to Amanda, feeling like foreshadowing here despite the fact that it obviously can't be. That along with this moment from Dana where she talks about how she isn't coming in to fall in love, which again finally plays into her downfall. But despite the fact that we do get 13 players here, we only get 8 of those moving in at first, while the other 5 are saved for later as part of this season's big twist, which we will talk about. But the move in here ends up being pretty standard for these earlier seasons, where they do end up putting a lot of focus on the picking of the beds, which really doesn't matter, though to be fair, some of the alliances do end up breaking down by sleeping arrangements later on, with Jack, Erica, and David being in a room together to where they work closely moving forward. Also here, we do get Nathan just shutting June down after she wants to share beds with him, which was funny. Though also here, we do instantly see Allison talking about liking Nathan, and just in general, Allison really comes off as this sweet and innocent girl off the bat here, though she obviously later becomes known for having this snarky, mean-spirited side to her as well, particularly after the arrival of the exes. Though this really ends up highlighting this massive dichotomy with Allison across this season, with her switching between these two personas on a dime, and I feel like over time the fandom has interpreted this as the real Allison being this cutthroat version of her that we do see in the DR at points, but when watching this season, and by also seeing the other people's perceptions of her, it becomes very clear that Allison is actually this very conflicted figure across this season, possibly being the most complex figure in Big Brother history up to this point, and a lot of that gets exemplified through her relationship with Donnie, her boyfriend back at home, which ends up being a major storyline across this season. But during the player introductions, we do get the first of June's really snarky confessionals, talking about Erica's surgical enhancements, and talking about how she's reached her peak and is now on her way down, and June obviously ends up winning this season, and gets talked about as this game changer for innovating on the floater strategy, which we will talk about. But really for me, I feel like I remember June more so for her really cutting DRs like this, probably being one of the best confessionalists in the history of Big Brother, though it does largely come off as extremely mean-spirited along the way, with her making a wide range of personal attacks that haven't aged well, to where I feel like she certainly would have gotten in trouble for a lot of the things that she said on this season if this was in the modern day, and really that doesn't just pertain to June, where also the likes of Allison, Erica, Justin, Robert, and probably more people on this cast all end up exhibiting really icky behavior and icky comments across this season that again just wouldn't fly in the modern day, and it does give the season a much more negative tone to me, though really the worst of it doesn't end up making the show here. But here we do get introduced to David, who comes off as his class clown, and it's a fun early boot on this season, and that gets matched with us getting to hear from Jack, who talks about wanting to work with him as they can bond over talking about discipline and order, which I just found to be a funny line. And really as a whole, I do love Jack on this season, where he's a guy that the show really props up as being this very savvy player due to his FBI background, when in reality he kind of sucks at the game and is either having incorrect reads or is just really ineffective at the game throughout a lot of it. But I still found them to be a very likable figure here, probably the most likable in a largely unlikable cast. But also here we get introduced to Dana, with her coming off very forward and instantly talking about her dislike of Allison, which again feels like unintentional foreshadowing here, along with the fact that we literally also get this segment ending with June getting a DR, talking about how she's playing up being happy-go-lucky when in reality she is there to win, which would have been a very clear winner quote if this had been pre-taped. But this leads us to the first food comp, again in line with the other early premieres, where we do get this fine icebreaker style comp of the players standing on beams, answering questions about their group, and if they're wrong, the beam rises, and they can't have more than 3 people drop here to win food, and they really end up succeeding here pretty easily, without much intrigue here, outside of Nathan saying that he wanted a tiger if he's on a deserted island, and David continuing to be a horn dog here, being happy that there aren't any virgins in the house, though that obviously doesn't last. And that is then followed up by the reveal of the big twist in the season, that being the X Factor, where we do learn that for the first time in Big Brother history, not every house guest will be a stranger to one another. A trend that strangely ends up continuing all the way up to BB10, feeling like a go-to twist for Big Brother in the early days, to have some sort of pre-existing relationship coming into the game. And this starts us off in a position where I do find it to be a largely unnecessary twist to add to the game so early on in Big Brother's history. I mean, Big Brothers 2 and 3 were both successes, both in terms of reception, but also in terms of ratings. So I really don't get why they felt like they needed to add in this very gimmicky and trashy twist here, in that the X Factor obviously ends up being that some of these players will be paired up with their exes, which again feels like a twist that you would do when your show's formula has gotten stale. But again, with the show still being fresh at this point, I still found this to just be an overall questionable choice here. It even ends up being strange in its execution, where you would think that if they're dedicated to this theme, you would think that the entire cast would be part of this twist in a similar way to how they handled BB6. But instead, we strangely only have 5 pairs here, where Nathan, Dana, and Jack all get out of this scot-free, which ends up having its pros and cons game-wise for them, as obviously they don't have the awkwardness that comes from having your ex in the house to hinder their games, but also they don't have the potential benefits of having an ex in the game, and that could be an easy secret alliance for you, which ends up being a very effective strat for some of the X pairs moving forward. But even beyond that, I do feel like there are a couple major negatives that come from this twist, that being 2 of the bigger negatives for this entire season as a whole. The first of which being that I do think this twist plays a major factor into the weaker casting for this season, where just like a Blood vs. Water season, it does very much feel like the X pairings here were largely cast with one player in mind, while the other is more so a tag along, with the likes of Amanda and Justin just being kind of boring casting choices here. Robert is Robert, and Michelle can be fun, but really brought nothing to the game, while G is a more interesting casting choice here, though one that was also an alternate, which makes me question, why was he an alternate when June was always going to be part of the cast? And while I've always personally enjoyed G as a character on this season, even he can be looked at as pretty monotone, and it's certainly not as good of a character as June, so I do think this twist did perpetuate a weaker cast for this season. But another issue with this twist, and probably the most detrimental one to the season, is the fact that it ends up being such a major focus on the show. particularly during these early weeks, to the point where a lot of the strategy and the house dynamics weren't well explained until later on in the season, because we had to continue to get segment after segment about how these exes are co-inhabiting and focusing on their past issues and them repairing their relationships, which again is just not riveting TV in my eyes. Though is obviously the reason that they did this twist to begin with, to really exploit these relationships, and while I do feel like it could have been done in a pretty interesting way, I do feel like the way it was handled here just comes off as really repetitive. But the moment of the players learning about this twist and the eventual walk-in are scenes played over and over again on this season, and interestingly, despite the OG players getting the warning about their exes coming in here, the exes themselves end up being surprised when they come in, and also end up coming in with a major disadvantage, where here we do see the OG 8 instantly make an alliance to target the exes, with them having the numbers to control any vote and also having better odds to win the HOH, giving this majority 8 this massive advantage just from being chosen to enter the game first, which is a pretty lame aspect of this twist. Though really beyond week 1, I do feel like the way that this pack ends up unraveling is probably in the most interesting way it could have played out. And we do get this fun segment here of the players in the house speculating on whose ex will come through the door, with June instantly knowing that G will be coming through, which is kind of funny considering again he was an alternate. But we once again see Allison instantly crack here, talking about her boyfriend's going to be upset, and instantly gets emotional, seeming to now be facing the reality that she's probably going to end up doing things that will end up ruining her relationship back at home, and mentions that she is going to flirt, and that if her boyfriend sees something he doesn't approve of, he'll just stop watching and it'll be over. And again, Allison's relationship with Donnie here, comes off extremely toxic, but still, I do feel like it plays a major toll on Allison's state of mind across this season, with her constantly seeming to fluctuate on how worried she is about her relationship back at home. But also here we do end up seeing interviews with the ex-pairs here before they enter the game, where it does feel weird that they didn't expect this twist just coming into the season, considering they were asked these questions pre-season that explicitly had them detailing this one specific relationship, which is kind of strange. But here we do get the initial setup of the X dynamics, which obviously becomes a major focus during the early portions of this season, where Scott and Amanda seem to have a pretty hostile relationship here, which ends up bringing a lot of drama to this first week. Allison and Justin don't really get that much of a setup here, though it never felt like they had that much hostility towards each other. June and G had the longest relationship of the bunch and clearly come off as radically different people. We get David and Michelle, who never seemed like much of a real relationship, having dated in high school, and Michelle turned him down for sex, still being a virgin, and them still being friends coming into this, with them having more of a brother-sister relationship, which is obviously a massive departure from the other pairings in the game, though Michelle does have a funny line here about talking about how she's grown up a lot since then, with her being 19 and clearly not being taken seriously by the other players in the game. But also we get introduced to the Erica-Robert dynamic, which ends up being a pretty strange one here, with Robert revealing that he had cheated on her, and instantly comes off really unlikable here, with him revealing that he's cheated on everybody that he's ever been with, and instantly calls Erica a bitch once going in. Though the reconciliation of their relationship ends up being a pretty nice storyline later on in the season, though I don't believe that sticks. Though the reconciliation of their relationship ends up being a major storyline later on in the season, and an interesting aspect of their relationship here is the fact that they end up being the only pair of exes here that actually end up directly targeting each other during the early portions of the game here. But the first episode does conclude with the exes moving in, which ends up being a pretty dramatic scene and a really solid cliffhanger here. But that brings us to the rest of week 1, where again the following episode gives us the reactions to the exes coming in, with most of them obviously being upset, except for David, who is relieved that's Michelle instead of a different ex, which finally just undercuts the twist right away. But we do follow that up with some drama around the exes getting bed passes, getting the opportunity to take the bed of another player, which obviously this is just a terrible move to use this pass, as it just pisses off the players already in the majority, in a position where you're also just disadvantaged from coming in late. And we do see Amanda, Michelle, and Justin rightfully not using it, though Robert, being Robert, ends up taking Allison's bed, while G for some reason takes Dana's, which is even a worse choice there, considering of all people, it's Dana, who gets pissed off, as you would expect here, and now wants to target G, though really, that doesn't amount to anything. But really, it's just showing how naive G and Robert are in the game here, where they're just confused over why people are annoyed at them. But following this, and really throughout the entire week, like most of old school Big Brother, they do end up using this extended week 1 to good use in terms of getting us to know this cast pretty well, giving us a lot of segments focusing around individual characters. Though I will say, in contrast to BB's 2 and 3, a lot of these segments felt very mean-spirited, where it felt like a lot of these were being used to mock these players, which just gives the season an overall different tone to that of Big Brothers 2 and 3. We're here right away, we get Michelle getting this big dodo edit with no one really taking her seriously, and Jack even calling her the house mascot. We also get a lot of objectification of women here, with Michelle and Erica spending a lot of their time in their bikinis. We also get some pretty mean-spirited comments about Dana, with her getting called a man troll, and Scott ends up making a song about her, talking about not knowing if she's a man or a troll, which obviously ends up upsetting her. We also get June, Dana, and Allison having this girl talk, where really, again, it's just them mocking the other players' appearances. And also June then gets DRs where she gets to mock Allison and Dana as well. And this is then followed up by the editors mocking June herself. So again, just a weird negative energy to this season right away here, being filled with so many personal attacks. But also here we do get some more fun segments. We get one that really highlights G's character, with Scott ending up giving him a haircut, with G thinking that he was a barber, when in reality he is a waiter, being this funny, naive G segment here, where we do get this series of people trying to fix his haircut, only for us to lead up to David giving him a Ranger haircut, to where we then cut to David in a DR talking about how he butchered him, which is just overall a pretty funny segment. Also here we have Jack getting his as expected FBI segment, and him really just hamming it up in the DR, giving this rundown of every player, to which he ends up having completely wrong reads on everybody, saying that June isn't going to last long and that Allison isn't a strong player, really showing him underestimating the eventual final 2 here. Well, also, this ends up starting his one-sided rivalry with Justin that really takes up a bulk of his run on this season, with him instantly wanting to target Justin from the beginning here. Though interestingly, Jack is also the player that ends up calling out June's strategy of her trying to be the house cook and her using that as a game tactic, which she was doing, though I do think it gets a bit overstated how effective of a strategy this ends up being, as I really don't think her cooking ability here ended up changing anybody's minds in how they were actually playing the game. Though I think a more interesting aspect of this strategy is that with the kitchen being located kind of in the center of the house, in sight of numerous meeting places in the house, it really ends up putting her in a position where she can easily scope out the house, seeing who is talking to who, and that can be a minor benefit to her, though again, I really just don't feel like it ends up mattering too much here. Now beyond that, we do get the typical first luxury comp of having to unlock the hot tub, which ends up being this very generic wiping slime off of each other competition, though here we do randomly get a callback to Jerry from BB3. But also here we end up getting a food comp, which ends up being just as boring as ever, though some humor comes from the fact that they almost get no food through this competition, instead just end up winning beer. But again, during this week, we also get a lot of focus on the X dynamics, where we do see June just ignoring G, though we do learn about her having helped him through his father's death, and we see him thanking her for that, which is a nice moment. Though beyond that, we get more of a hostile setup to the Scott-Amanda relationship, with them fighting right away, with Scott just being a dick to her, and talks about wanting her out, despite the fact that he later regrets that, which really just ends up showing you the mood swings Scott was having across his run here. We also later see more of the Allison-Justin dynamic, with them seeming to be cordial, though Allison talks about needing to stab him in the back, strangely saying that she's doing that because she cares for him, clearly showing that she still has feelings for him. That plays into why she's constantly worried about her relationship back at home, and really ends up showing her gameplay pertaining to Justin in a more emotional light here, though we do see them creating a secret deal here as well, being the first of these secret alliances between these ex-pairs, though this one never seemed to be truly genuine from Allison. While I do feel like from Justin's point of view, he was looking at it as a real deal, as long as it didn't overtake his real alliance, in that being the Three Stooges, or the Dream Team they call themselves, which we do see them form here, with it essentially just being the three ex-guys coming together, though they end up forming a really strong bond and strangely end up having a pretty deep run this season, despite the fact that they are constantly targeted throughout the season, starting off in a really rough position here, being the clear targets for the now named Elite Eight, which ends up detailing the two sides of the house at this point in the game, being the biggest deep dive we get into the house dynamics for the first couple weeks, largely showing this dynamic because it was forced upon them by the nature of the twist. Which, while an initial downside here, it does end up actually opening up the game for the later prominence of floaters, giving them two sides to easily bounce off of. Though also here we see some pairings come together, us seeing Nathan and Allison forming a bond, with Allison openly talking about in the DR that she's playing him and that she's essentially using him as a meat shield, talking about letting him make a target of himself, which this aspect of Allison's gameplay is something that really ends up being a major part of her legacy to this day. And also here we do see Dana and June instantly bond as well, to where they end up being pretty central figures within the house over the next few weeks. But beyond this, we finally get to some true game talk, strangely with Scott being the first one to talk about plans for this week, wanting to target Justin, again being looked at as this massive target for the Elite Eight right away, leading us to the first HOH, which is a pretty lame one that has the players pairing up, with one player in each pair having to participate in an endurance comp of kneeling on buttons, while the other literally just gets to sit there in a lounge chair and do nothing, outside of getting covered in chum when they're eliminated, which is all just really lame. And for some reason they end up repeating a similar comp for the following season as well, and really just all this feels like a massive downgrade in my eyes from the Wheel of First Impressions, which I've always loved as the first HOH in BBs 2 and 3. Though also here they add a bit of an arbitrary aspect to the challenge of there being one person that has to sit out due to the odd number of players, with that person being Scott here, and in turn he gets to pick which of the winning pair ends up becoming the HOH. Which, I mean, really, it's like, who cares, as more times than not, the winning pair will guarantee themselves safety anyway, and even then, more than likely, the person in this decision is going to pick the person that was actually doing the work. So again, it really is a pretty pointless addition to this comp. Here, the comp ends up coming down to Justin and Nathan, where they do end up agreeing to a deal, with Nathan promising Robert and Justin safety if they drop, to which they end up following through with, and Nathan becomes the HOH, giving the Elite Eight the power this week, though also with Nathan sticking to his word, ends up really limiting the options for the Alliance, with the first two picks now being safe, which in turn leads to the noms becoming G and Amanda, with almost no explanation on the show, though obviously if you think about it logically, the only other option was Michelle, who was sharing a bed with Nathan. So again, not that shocking of a result here, though what is shocking is the targets, where for some reason Amanda is the target here instead of G, which I get that the negative energy that Scott is bringing to the house ends up painting this target onto Amanda, but she really doesn't have anybody in the game, so targeting her instead of G, who is clearly part of a three-person alliance that includes two of the bigger targets on the board, makes this all a really questionable choice for most of the house. But along the way, while nothing really amounts from this right away, we do start to see the Elite Eight fracturing, with there clearly being two sides within the group, with Scott, Erica, Jack, and David forming a subgroup, all while Nate seems to be working with June, Dana, and Allison, being this split within the group that Nate tries to keep the peace within, though we do end up seeing June, Allison, and Dana wanting to target Erica by the end of the week, along with the Stooges also supporting that plan, though this plan never ends up going through. And with that finally takes us to the Scott storyline, with him being a major source of drama across this first week, obviously all culminating in his explosive exit. But this all starts with a truth or dare game that is being played by most of the younger players in the house, to which Scott comes in and calls them immature and gets upset at them, drinking all the beers, leading to Scott making a target of himself in this moment and really just coming off as a negative presence to the rest of the house, to the point where it seems like he's only saved here due to the fact that he was just part of that initial group and is in turn part of the Elite Eight. But following this, we just get segment after segment showing Scott's mental health seeming to deteriorate, where we do see him having these really awkward conversations with Amanda, with him clearly wanting her back despite all the talk about how much he hates her earlier. And then he proceeds to declare his love for her and ends up being really defensive of her. Where after Nathan's nomination speech calling Amanda untrustworthy, we do see Scott getting really upset at Nathan and now wants to target him. And we also get worry of Scott winning the veto and using it on Amanda, which obviously does end up happening here as Dana wins the veto instead, though I guess I should mention the modification to the veto for this season, where after BB3 had the silver power of veto for every regular veto comp during that season, this season finally ends up having the golden power of veto for that role, which again is something that should have been there to begin with, where the silver power veto was greatly underpowered, and in this format, even the golden power veto ends up being underpowered here, as this is still a point in Big Brother history where everyone was participating in the veto comp, obviously decreasing the chances that someone that will use the veto will end up winning it, and through that the veto rarely comes to use across this season. Though obviously they later end up modifying this rule for the next season, to which it ends up narrowing the number of players in the veto comp to 6, which again feels like a direct counter to how it rarely ends up affecting this season. But following this, we do return to the Scott storyline, where it ends up all culminating here, where we proceed to get this montage of Scott's increasingly volatile behavior, and we get talk about him being miserable and just drifting throughout most of the day, leading up to the big incident where Scott starts randomly throwing chairs around the kitchen, leading to him being called by the DR and him yelling at the camera saying, "You can't handle me." And this leads up to him calling a house meeting where he attempts to apologize for his actions, though that doesn't go over well. And this is where we do get Scott going into the DR following this and never coming back, having been expelled from the game, being the second ever expulsion from the show, which they never truly clarify the exact reason why, which obviously you can tell that the players felt unsafe, and you can just assume that he was taken out due to misbehavior, though I believe there are rumblings that during this confrontation at the end, he ends up revealing that he had an STD, and that ends up playing a factor into why he was DQ'd here. Though really, no matter what, I feel like you do have to expel him in this situation where he's becoming increasingly hard to control. And even then, no matter what, it didn't really feel like Scott was long for this game anyway. And I mean, with that, let's just talk about Scott now, where again, Scott ends up being this really volatile presence on the show here, going out in this really explosive way. And again, I just felt like it was the correct choice to expel him here. This feeling like the natural ending point for his story, where despite the fact that he ends up being this massive presence during this first week, it ends up being for like all the wrong reasons. Though I will say, I do wonder what would have happened had Amanda not ended up joining the game, where Scott obviously seemed to have some demons he had to deal with, though I do wonder how much of that mental state was affected by his ex, who he had a very complex relationship with, was in the game with him here. Though either way, I mean, he did seem to be a pretty bad player just on the offset, with him getting on people's nerves even before these things started to play a major factor on his state of mind. So again, I wouldn't have had much faith in him, even if he wasn't hampered by this twist. But with that gets us to the first eviction episode, which I will say kind of surprised that they went through with the first eviction here, where after Scott's ejection and it happening with only one more episode left in the round, you would think that they would have just canceled the eventual eviction, especially because his ejection does end up affecting the scheduling of the season later on, which plays a factor into the late game really getting dragged out, with a full week being spent on literally every single round of gameplay, which ends up making the end of this season a lot more mundane. But this episode ends up starting off with talk about the veto, with the likes of Jack, Erica, and David still wanting Justin out, and they end up trying to convince Nathan and Dana to use the veto in order to blindside him, though Nathan is clearly not on board with this, and really nothing ends up coming out of it. Though interestingly, we do hear from Dana, of all people, that she wants to use this info about this plan to end up playing both sides and getting Justin to go after the other side, which again, it's funny to see Dana, of all people, being the first on this season to be shown playing this floater role that June and Allison end up being known for later on in the season. But following this, we do get to what is probably one of the more surreal scenes to ever make air in Big Brother. something that certainly would not be shown on TV nowadays. But here we do have David talking about his attraction to Amanda and that he's going to start talking to her now that Scott is gone, leading to us abruptly cutting to Nate giving them the keys to the HOH, where they end up being the first players in the history of BBUS to have sex in the house, which obviously happens all the time in modern Big Brother, though they really make a big deal out of this here, going as far as showing us the overhead shot of the room as they're under the covers, which is just so weird. Again, this is obviously them playing into this sex sells mantra, but this really ends up being a really awkward inclusion to the show here, feeling largely unnecessary. Though, it does make you wonder again, why is David voting out Amanda over G? Now, I know he eventually expresses regret in this, though this 100% would have been the better move for David here, with him seeming to be Amanda's closest relationship in the game, while G again had so many other options. Though a flip to this nature never seemed to be a practicality. Now, before the eviction, we do get a couple other segments here with us getting to see the exes' families react to the twist, to which we see G's current girlfriend making personal attacks towards June, which again makes you feel like he has a type. But also we get this funny visual from Donnie, who is watching the show on the smallest TV ever, and he humorously slams his fists on the couch, which just felt very scripted. But this is where we do get more of Allison's dichotomy, with her saying that she'll be with Donnie until they die, only for us to then cut to Allison and Nathan kissing under the covers, showing her cheating on her boyfriend on national TV, which ends up giving us our first glimpse into why exactly Allison is worried about her relationship back home. Now also here we do get catch-up segments with the cast of BB3, as we did last season. They're still fun to have here, though not much of note really ends up happening here, outside the reveal that Josh was in Playgirl, so good for him, I guess. And also the fact that Jason's still a virgin, which obviously we needed an update on. But eventually we get to the eviction, which ends up being a unanimous vote for Amanda. And for some reason, we still get the loved ones of the pre-jurors being flown out there for this really awkward reunion, which really feels like a waste of money for Big Brother. And obviously they do end up stopping this moving forward, though this one in particular is just kind of funny, with her being reunited with her brother and father right after they just showed her having sex on national television. But either way, we lose Amanda here, who was just kind of boring in her short time on this season, where while she does have a couple notable moments, like her being the first person to have sex in the Big Brother house, and also her having this tumultuous relationship with Scott, there really wasn't much that she actively did across this season, not even campaigning to stay, and seeming to be okay with going home here. I mean, she just never really felt too into the game, where, again, to be fair, Scott being there could have played a factor into that, though it really just felt like she was cast here as a consequence of the X Factor twist, as otherwise I really don't see what they saw in her coming into this season. Below that, we're finally moving on to week 2, which starts off with the first appearance of the Majority Rules HOH comp, one that I've always enjoyed and was a recurring comp in early Big Brother, though obviously stops getting used after it really just ends up being a very easy game to game, which we really see culminate in BB Can 1, but here it actually does lead to the best possible outcome, and that the final 2 ends up being Justin and G, 2 of the X's, and we do get a lot of awkwardness in Julie trying to rush through the tiebreaker, which has them tying again, leading to them using the question, how many days old is Amanda, which I just found funny. But here we do see G winning HOH, which obviously leads to talk about the Elite 8 having to break up, and we do continue to get fractures across this week, which obviously eventually reached their breaking point in the following week, with a lot of that focus coming from Dana, who ends up finding herself at the bottom of her alliance by the end of this week due to her close connections to the Stooges on the other side of the house, but also her just outright annoying everyone. And we do get segments about how just everything pisses her off, getting a montage of her saying pissed off. Though also here we do get a segment about Nathan, where everyone just ends up mocking his accent and saying golly. But beyond that, we also get another boring food comp, where outside of Nathan's freak out over not being able to eat meat. Though I did find it funny that eventually when we get around to June's birthday, they literally end up giving the house half a cake, which just felt like the producers further taunting the have-nots. But also we get another moment that would only be in old school Big Brother. We're playing off of the peanut butter bikinis from the previous season. Here we end up getting lettuce and tomato bikinis, which don't end up being as notable. And this all ends up leading up to a pretty big dick moment from David, of him pulling Michelle's bikini off. But beyond that, I mean, this ends up being a week that's actually kind of light on character moments, with a lot of the screen time here being dedicated to the game talk. But strangely, game talk that doesn't end up mattering that much for this week, with them trying to hide the true house dynamics until the end of the week, which feels like a more modern style of editing that can be interesting as a shake-up to the standard formula, though here I just find it to be mostly underwhelming that we never get shown what is really happening during most of this week, which makes the edited product of this week come off as pretty underdeveloped, because a lot of it just ends up following the perspective of the Stooges, who clearly think they are in control when really they're being played throughout the entire week. Having the HOH here, though in reality everyone else is just playing circles around them. Though again, we do get a lot of drama around Dana this week, with her getting closer to the Stooges, to where we do get a bulk of the Elite 8 Alliance actually campaigning against her because of that. Which actually makes no sense that they're campaigning to the Stooges for them to get rid of someone that has just gotten closer to them, which in turn gives them no reason to actually get rid of Dana here. So obviously that doesn't go through, though we do actually see G actually be considering putting her up as a Renom, which is certainly a choice. But a target for the Stooges here ends up being Erica, with Erica having sketched people out in the previous week, but also with Robert really wanting to target her, and Robert's constant attempts to take her out, only for him to end up failing, and the time that Erica is eventually taken out is in a position where he actually wants to keep her, is all a pretty funny storyline there. Though again, we get a lot of cockiness from him here, talking about how Erica's going to be voted out unanimously, which I really don't get how they thought this was a reality when Jack and David were clearly on her side, and they openly talk about that. Now, I know that David and Jack had a deal with the Stooges, but again, how they actually believe that they were going to stick true to it, though. Though, by the way, I guess I should also mention that this ends up being the week where we do get introduced to the Erica and Jack relationship, being this father-daughter style relationship, though one that, again, never really did much for me, especially considering how much older Erica is in comparison to the other daughter figures that are in this style of relationship on reality TV. And really, their dynamic doesn't really bring much good TV either. I mean, they largely end up sticking to themselves, both really relishing in their incorrect reads in the game. But with Erica as the target, the Stooges now need a pawn, which you would think that the likes of Jack would be a good option here. But instead, they end up deciding to put up Michelle, which is just idiotic, with Michelle being the only other ex in the game, and really just making her an easy target in the case that the Elite 8 ends up sticking together, which obviously they do. Being another perennial example of the pawn going home, but again, the show doesn't properly portray this, not really highlighting how dumb of a move this is until right before the eviction. Though here we do get some campaigning from David in order to try to save Michelle here, with him wanting to get Dana on the block instead. And again, the edit ends up focusing more on this decision from them of not putting Dana up, instead of focusing on how dumb it is to put up Michelle. But during the nom ceremony, we do have G giving a Nathan-like speech to Erica here, to where she says in a DR that she doesn't take it personally, only for her to then walk into the backyard and ends up making racist remarks about G, which ends up being a really rough moment here. And in general, I believe Erica as a whole supposedly got a pretty good edit on this season. So this is a moment that was even terrible back in the day, but they're just openly making racist remarks here. But following this, we do get a short scene of Jack telling Erica that everything is going according to plan, being one of the only times Jack is actually having a decent read on what is going on in the game. So again, that doesn't get much focus here and is more so just a throwaway comment. But this is where we do get the setup to what is probably one of the most important alliances in the early game here, in that being a secret alliance between June and G, being the ex-pair that most effectively works together in the game here, with them not seeming to have suspicion on them, and June ends up really effectively using G in this game, which ends up keeping her safe later on, with them seeming to make the most out of the X Factor twist here. Though interestingly, at this point in the game, this did seem like a genuine final two from both players' perspectives, with them talking that way in a DR, though this is also where we do get some sloppy play from June, where with Dana now being a social pariah in the house and June having a good relationship with her, we do have June leaking information to her, telling her that Nathan actually hates her and that everyone is coming for her, which with Dana being Dana, obviously she ends up going around confronting people over this information, allowing them to realize that June is the one leaking this information to her, which could have put her in danger here, though G ends up doing damage control for her here. Though interestingly, Dana ends up coming out of this conversation thinking that it was Allison that put the target on her back, which continues her hostility for her. But here we do end up getting Duck Ball, the game that they played around the house in BB3, as the veto competition here, which is a nice cool callback there. But here we do see David winning the veto here, putting him in a tough position as he is close to both of the nominees. And he also had made a deal with the Stooges to not use the veto. But here we do see some hard campaigning for Dana to be on the block once again. But once G turns this down, we do see Nathan creating this plan to have David surprise G at the veto ceremony. And though that doesn't go through, I assume G wouldn't have put up Dana at that point, with David having broken his word. But following this, we do end the veto episode with Jack saying in the DR that they think Erica is going, but that isn't going to happen. Again, alluding to the fact that Erica is going to stay with the numbers of the Elite 8 backing her, though again, that never gets properly explained until the beginning of the eviction episode, though interestingly, we do get Dana now becoming the swing vote here, where they're seeming to want Erica out, though does still end up aligning with the Elite 8 by the end of the week, which all sets up this really great blindside where Julie ends up asking Robert a question before the eviction, and we have him just gloating over how Erica is leaving. Again, having the Stooges end up acting so cocky here, only for their faces to drop when it's revealed that it's a 6-2 vote to evict Michelle, who also ends up being extremely emotional on her way out. And all just an all-time great blindside for the show on paper. The one that, again, I wish just was shown in a more interesting way, where this edit here just makes it feel like we're missing out on a lot of what led this to happen. But with that, we obviously lose Michelle, who really just comes off as a slightly better version of Amanda here, being one that really didn't do much in the game and seemed to be an easy person to take out because of that, though she obviously gets taken out under stranger circumstances here, being the pawn and being taken out due to unlucky circumstances. And she is obviously a much better character than Amanda, being a really naive figure that did have a number of funny moments, being the stereotypical ditzy blonde girl. And through that, I do also kind of just feel for her in the way that she goes out here, with her seeming like someone that just played when they were a bit too young, having very little life experience, and in turn ends up leading to the lack of respect she had in the game, which ends up making her an expendable number for most of the players in the house. But with that brings us to week 3, probably the best week of this season, with this finally being the week where the Elite 8 blows up, which all starts with the best possible HOH result here, with Dana winning the HOH in a position where she literally just wins from everyone else getting the question wrong. But with Dana being the house pariah coming into this week, this now obviously gives her the opportunity to blow the house wide open, which I will say that Dana turning against the Elite 8 has been remembered as a move that was so stupid of her to break up the majority alliance, but in reality, her move to flip here is one that's not that bad, largely because she was already in a terrible spot to begin with. And this at least allows her to shake up the status quo, where for me the true downsides of Dana's game were not her flipping, but instead her getting herself at the bottom of the Elite 8 to begin with, where it's because she's in that position that she has to flip. At this point, though realistically, no matter what, she's pretty much screwed. Or she's either on the bottom of the majority alliance, so where she's going to be the first one picked off there, or she's potentially flipping to another alliance to where, again, she could be on the bottom of that one as well, but even if she isn't, she probably won't have the respect to win the game because she just flipped and betrayed half the house. So, again, I just think overall she was just in a terrible spot to begin with. But we do start the week with reactions to the previous eviction, with Robert talking about thinking the result was a mistake at first. And we do see him getting into a fight with Erica later on in the week, saying that if they're in the final 6 together, it'll be hell, which seemed like a very specific statement to make here, and obviously does end up happening. But it's also this week where we finally get our first Robert misses his daughter segment. That ends up being this really sympathetic content for him on this show, and really ends up being the only semblance of likability Robert has on this season. But really, to me, it just reminds me even more that he is this proto-evil dick style figure here. But also here we end up seeing Justin thinking he's screwed, only for him to then get the best HOH result for him, which again, just in general, the Stooges get really lucky in this position that Dana wins HOH, with her obviously siding with them and doing their dirty work for them, while also further putting a target on her back through making this move as well. And this is where we do get introduced to the Justin Dana showmance, which really seems to play a major role into getting Dana to commit to flipping here, and was part of what caused her to be distrusted to begin with. But Dana ends up wanting to split the house down the middle by aligning herself and June with the Stooges, which, while June seems to be apprehensive of this plan, June does end up deciding to stick with Dana here, which I will say that despite June being known as this big floater in the game, at this point she's not really floating as much and is really just outright flipping against her own alliance, though is just in a position where Dana takes the brunt of the blame for it. Though again, June was still involved in this flip here, though we do see June attempting to get Dana to not go through with the flip, and finally ends up warning Dana that her making this move will cause her to be distrusted by both sides, and that the Stooges will eventually flip on her, which is exactly what ends up happening. But interestingly, we do get talk from Nathan this week of him calling out June's gameplay style, only for him to mention that there is nothing that he can do about it, as there are just more dangerous players on the other side. In essence, showing the brilliance of June's game, and that even in positions where she finds herself within an actual alliance, she's never the biggest target within that alliance. And through that, she just never ends up getting truly targeted throughout this game. Here, June ends up getting her own segment talking about how funny she is, and she declares herself the queen of the house, though also while here she has mentioned that if she wins, the plan would be to open up an escort service, which the show plays this off as a joke, but I mean, this is what she ends up doing with the money. Also, we do get a food comp here, which again, just ends up being boring, though finally they do win Burger King, which is not the only time we get a fast food sponsor for this season. But here we do end up seeing Dana formulate this plan to target Allison, where again, she had already disliked her from the beginning, but now with her also blaming her for the target on her back, and also Allison being Justin's ex, which probably played a factor here. Allison ends up being the big target for the week, and Allison does end up learning about this, leading to a series of fights between her and Justin and Dana that ends up fully solidifying her placement on the block, though the question is who goes next to her. And really, the eventual nom never gets explained on the show, and like the previous week, we do see a very questionable choice for the pawn here that directly ends up backfiring on Dana the following week in her deciding to nominate Jack, which I get the rationale for. I mean, nominating two people that are on different ends of the other side to try to fracture them even more. But if you're trying to get rid of Allison, again, why not just put Nathan beside her? The only person that would even consider taking her off the block with the veto, and also someone that seemed pretty likely to win the veto. So this just ends up being a terrible decision that ends up directly leading to Dana's eventual eviction. Again, another misstep that I think is a worse one than the initial decision to flip on the Elite 8. But with these noms, we do surprisingly see the likes of Erica and David backing Allie over Jack, which considering their close relationship to Jack, it does seem counterproductive, though they do end up looking at Allie as a more powerful asset down the road, which considering Allie's later comp ability, they aren't wrong as long as they can keep Allie on their side, which, spoiler alert, they cannot. But really, this rivalry with Dana ends up changing Allie's portrayal on the show, fully turning her into this more villainous figure where they're talking about drop kicking Dana in the throat and constantly calling her names. That is really the persona of Allie that we know her for nowadays. But coming into the veto, we do see Allie telling Nathan that he needs to win it, which he declares that he would be okay if it's just the two of them versus the world, obviously showing you how much he trusted Allie in this game. And he obviously does proceed to win the veto, and obviously plans on using it on Allie, which again gets hyped up nowadays of this being a big moment of Allie being this seductress, tricking Nathan into doing what's against his best interest, though I personally don't have that much of an issue with Nathan using the veto here. I mean, obviously at the end of the day, he is too trusting of Allie, and Allie is willing to let him go down the road and does make moves that increase the chances of Nathan getting taken out when he does. But even then, I mean, Allie never actively wanted him out of the game. And Nathan using the veto honor here doesn't really end up changing the in-game dynamics that much, where while Allie does turn out to be a bad ally, at this point in the game, there was really no reason to think that as being true. And really, I feel like Nathan was in a bad position either way, where I think no matter what, he would have been targeted by the opposing side, and I'm sure people would be calling him an idiot if he did end up letting Allison go home here, his perceived number one ally. And again, all this move does is really just, again, piss off Dana and the Stooges, who were already probably coming for him, while Erica and Jack have nowhere to go anyway. So again, I really don't have that much of an issue with this decision, especially considering the information that he would have had at the time that he made it. Though I will say that I do think him blindsiding everyone at the veto ceremony was probably a bit much, and obviously you do still have to give Allison a lot of credit for this move and her getting Nathan to use the veto honor here. Though again, I do very much question how deceivious of a move this really was from Allison, as I do feel like a lot of it was her just being genuine and her truly wanting to work with Nathan at this point in the game. But leading up to the veto ceremony, we do also end up getting a pretty fun luxury comp, which conveniently ends up being a private dinner for the winner and a player of their choice, which Allison ends up winning, taking Nathan, which in itself leads to a lot of drama as Allison gets drunk and ends up flirting with Justin afterwards, and ends up leaking the plan for Nathan to use the veto honor, which obviously upsets him. And I should mention that the comp itself here does end up being a pretty notable one as well, of them being spun around in chairs and having to balance a glass on a play, and this leads to this notable moment of Jack falling and hitting his face, which ends up being referred to in All Stars. And also this is the week where we get Jack saying the only comment that ends up earning him any ire by the end of the season, in him saying Dana has the sex appeal of a buzzard's crotch, which is just a ridiculous line in itself, though I do find it funny how much this line insulted Dana when there are so many worse things said about her across this week. But really coming into the veto ceremony, again, there isn't really much setup for a renom, as obviously this was meant to be a surprise, and in turn we do see Dana talking about taking out one of the strongest members of the opposing team, renomming David, which, truth be told, should have been our target to begin with, where, again, targeting Allison always felt like a more emotional move, while taking out David feels like a more appropriate move in weakening the other side, taking out one of their strongest competitors and also severing his ties with Jack and Erica, while also it giving her the option to salvage her relationships with the likes of Nathan and Allison, who she was relatively close to early on in the season. The way she handles it here, again, is just all bad, where she ends up pissing off both Allison and Nathan without even getting one of them out either. Though while David's nom here does come out of nowhere, he does end up getting a lot of fun content across this week, with him pulling pranks around the house, with him messing with the chair that G just fixed. He ends up jumping into the pool while people are laying in a nearby hammock to end up soaking them. But the funniest segment to me was one involving Allison's toy elephant that he keeps on stealing and finding ridiculous ways to hide it and jokingly killing it in every way possible. But with David on the block, I mean, you would think that he would be dead to rights against Jack, but we do actually see Dana and the Stooges consider saving him here, as they do talk about wanting to use him to target Nate, which wouldn't have happened. And if they did end up saving him here, it would have been a really bad move for him, though they obviously don't go through with it. But even then, David still ends up getting Allison and Erica's votes to stay here. Again, Erica voting out Jack in this position, though David is still taken out in a 5-2 vote, in a position where we do get this Julie fake out, her saying Jack's name first, which freaks him out. But with that, we do lose David, who was a really fun character in the early days of this season, coming off as this comic relief character in the cast. Again, a cast filled with very unlikable people, and it felt like David was doing everything he could to make good TV here. And he is someone that I do think is a major Big Brother what if, where if he had made it further in the season, which he was poised to do had he made it through this round, I do think he could have easily been remembered as one of the stars of this season, but instead is a largely forgotten about figure nowadays. But still, he ended up having a lot of notable moments, from him pulling all these pranks, to him having sex with Amanda, to him going out in a pretty dramatic fashion here. Again, he does end up being a notable character to me, the one that I don't think is remembered as much as he should be. But with that, we're now at week 4, which ends up being the start of the jury phase, which, with that, I guess I should talk about the change to the jury format for this season, where this does end up being the first season of BBUS to have a sequestered jury, where every boot from the final 9 on will go to the jury house where they must stay without any contact from the outside world until the finale, where obviously they end up voting for the winner. Obviously a format different from BB's 2 and 3, where the eliminated players there were sent home, where they could then watch the show before eventually coming back for the finale. Now Daniel Reyes' loss in BB3 is commonly cited as the inciting incident for this change here, which is true, though as I mentioned in that retrospective, I do think the reason why has been a bit misconstrued, where people seem to think that it was due to production being upset that Danielle lost and did this to help someone like her win, which is clearly not the case. I mean, the reality is that this was a change made to save the show as a TV product, which has obviously made production realize that what happens on the televised show, particularly how people act in a DR, can now affect how people are going to end up voting, meaning that this would incentivize players to be fake in the DR in order to secure jury votes, which that would harm the product as a whole if players were not genuine for the DR, and also not being willing to play to their fullest potential under the worry that the jury will see this footage back at home. That would deter them from voting for him as well, and I do think this is a very welcome change here, one that adds to their overall game structure, adding a level of strategy on deciding who you want on the jury. Though again, with the Scott ejection on this season, it does make its place on this season in particular a bit strange, where the jury starts after only 3 weeks of gameplay, making this the shortest pre-jury in the history of the show. But now let's talk about the actual events of the week, where this ends up being a week focused around the downfall of Dana, which starts off in the most poetic way possible here, with Allison ending up winning the HOH in what is a ridiculous comp of them shaking containers to drop balls into a tube. But with Allison as HOH, obviously Dana is screwed unless she wins the veto, though really we do see all of her side worrying here, though we do get a moment here that really highlights why G is the better player of the Stooges, where G ends up being the only one to actually stay in the HOH room during the room reveal, leading to Allison saying that G is the only one on that side that's safe, which shows you that G at least had some decent game ability, which he continues to demonstrate over the course of the next few rounds, though obviously he is hindered by his overall naivety and his overconfidence that ends up being the death knell for him. But also along the way, we do get a series of weird segments across the week, where we do see Erica talking about this being a battle of good versus evil, and that the evil side all has tattoos, which is just weird to see this demonization of tattoos on the show. We also get to talk about how G is the only smoker in the house, to which Erica calls him out for smoking despite his dad dying of lung cancer, which is pretty judgy of her there, though we do get a great moment following this of G holding a ceremony for the anniversary of his father's death, which was a much more positive moment for him. Now also here we do get a segment about how much weight June has gained, which was just weird to see them body shaming her on the show. And that weirdly transitions us to the food comp, where June says that she wouldn't be upset to be on PB&J, only for her to win it anyway. But also here we do see Allie and Nathan bonding over the Bible, which was weird to see considering this is also the week where Allie starts to work against Nathan's best interest, as pretty early on we do see Allison land on Dana and June as the nominations, though the rest of her alliance at this point end up pushing her to target Justin as the biggest threat on the other side, but also someone who is directly coming for Nathan at this point in the game. Though I will say that while yes, getting rid of Justin is better for her side as a whole, it is a move that is not best for Allison herself, especially over the likes of Dana, so I really don't have any qualms with this decision. Though again, the way she handles this with her alliance here could be better, where they do start to resent her for this decision across this week, looking at this as a personal move from her end, which ends up tainting her overall jury perception by the end of it. And also along the way, they do recognize her starting to play both sides, where she does make a deal for safety with the Stooges, and this is where she really starts her floater trajectory in the game of her working both sides, and actually ends up doing so before June even ends up doing so here, despite June being looked at as this perpetual floater in Big Brother history, where again, this is a point in the game where June had actually picked a side that she planned on sticking with, though that side obviously ended up being the losing side for this round, which lands her on the block, while with Allison, she ends up being in the middle from this point forward, with both sides being upset at her, but like June, they aren't willing to waste a shot at her while there's other bigger targets coming for them. But here we do see Allison and June talk about working together for the first time, talking about keeping each other safe, though this is then followed by Allie putting June up. So I don't feel like she really took this deal too seriously at this point. Especially considering immediately following this, we do see her re-solidify her deal with Justin once again, which ends up overtaking her deal with June. But this conversation also ends up leading to a bit of icky content, which clearly comes off as homophobic here, where Allison talks about thinking Nathan is gay, to which Justin talks about how this is the funniest thing he's ever heard for some reason, and says that he's never going to hang out with him again, which again, mixing this in with his later segment about mocking Nathan over being in touch with his feminine side. I mean, this really just comes off very icky by modern standards. But this is also the point where the edit really starts to lean into Allison as this extremely flirtatious figure, with talk about how she's hooked up with every guy in the house, and giving us flashbacks of her making out with David, and here she gets a DR saying she's sorry to Donnie, but doing so in a bit of a sarcastic way that again really makes it difficult to truly understand Allison's state of mind here, where she constantly flips back and forth on how she's feeling about the Donnie situation, even in the DR. But coming into the veto comp, we do get Nathan, Jack, and Erica planning on using the veto in order to try to get Justin on the block, though it's all for naught, as the veto is this battleship-esque competition, which is pretty lame, as it's a comp that can easily have the majority come together to make sure a specific person doesn't win, and we do see that happen to Dana and June pretty early on here, only for G to then throw the comp to Robert at the end. Again, a decent move for G here, and it not giving him the pressure of having the opportunity to save June here, and in turn giving him no blood on his hands. Though as expected, Robert proceeds to not use the veto, leaving Dana on the block, to where she ends up going home unanimously here, though we do actually see a lot of scrambling for votes here, where she thinks she has the Stooges on her side, and she thinks there's a chance of flipping over Erica and Jack as well, though really June never seemed to be in that much danger here, as Dana never actually had the Stooges on her side, largely because G had always been fighting to keep her around, which ends up being the point in the game where June's secret deal with him comes to great use. Though June learning about Dana's deal making does lead to some drama here, with June calling her out for campaigning against her, something that Dana continuously denies for some reasons. So again, that was pretty dumb, though again, this ends up being a pretty simple Dana vote, with her ending up being the first juror, and Dana was a really incredible character on this season, being this hot-headed, paranoid player that got on most people's nerves, but ends up adding so much chaos to the early days of this season, and it really feels like a completely different season once she leaves, where she had been such a focus in the edit up to this point, to where following her boot here, the season does officially become the June and Allison show that the season is known for. But Dana is someone that I do feel like it could have been interesting to see her get another shot. While I do think All Stars is a pretty stacked lineup as is, I wouldn't have been upset if she found her way onto that cast. I think it would have been interesting to see her play there, to see her not being blind by Justin, also being able to correct her mistakes from the previous time. Though, to be fair, I don't think she actually would have been able to, but again, still would have been interesting to see. But again, with that, we're now at week 5, where we do get the power shifting once again, with Justin finally winning HOH. After getting second in most comps beforehand, finally winning on a question about Allison, which ends up pertaining to Allison's love of elephants, which I don't get how others didn't pick up on this, considering she literally has a toy elephant in the house that they were messing around with. But with Justin as HOH, like last week, it is pretty clear that Nathan is dead to rights here, or at least should be. And a lot of this week ends up containing this massive contrast with the Stooges having HOH-itis at this point, where G is like guarding the door to the HOH room, and we have Robert bragging about how cocky they're gonna act, saying that they want to humiliate everyone and be unbearable, which can really shows you Robert's game ability here. Though this does also lead to kind of a funny moment of Jack coming into the HOH room and saying his name is Kiss My Ass, and jokes around about how he's had their back since the beginning. But again, this is all countered by Nathan spending most this week just moping around, knowing that he's a dead man walking, and getting upset whenever he hears laughter coming from the other room, and having such a low energy in the DR all week, but also still ends up being really bitter towards Allison across this week, to the point where we do see him trying to make a deal with the Stooges to take her out. It does make another more valiant effort towards the end of the week. But also during this week, we do get a couple notable segments, like a bizarre food comp, which has them dressing up as different foods, and this felt like a precursor to the ridiculous costumes we would see in modern Big Brother. But through this comp, they also win Subway for a week, which is not the last fast food sponsor for this season. We also get this disgusting segment this week talking about Justin's poor hygiene and how he hasn't washed his shorts since entering the house. But also an interesting aspect of this week ends up being Allie's portrayal across it, bit, where, again, playing into this dichotomy of her split personalities, we do see her crying in a DR at the beginning of the week, talking about feeling guilty over having gotten rid of Dana, only to then later in the week say that she feels no remorse for it. And also ends up being extremely harsh towards Nathan across the week, feeling like she's kind of lying to herself in these instances, where it does feel like Allison is a pretty emotional person, but someone that's trying to cover it up under this guise of this more cutthroat player. But beyond that, we do also get a luxury comp here that, again, would not fly nowadays, of the players being forced to strip their clothes in the middle of some foam. And there's a lot of talk about sneaking a peek on the women. Again, that hasn't aged well. Also, the veto for this week ends up coming off as really underwhelming as well, with it being Corridor, this chess-like game that is one that's just so easy for the majority to gang up on their target, and really with that, Nathan had no chance in this challenge. And Robert ends up winning once again, obviously keeping the noms the same, with Nathan seeming to be on his way out when he's next to Jack here. But again, this ends up being the week where Allison does end up going all in on playing this floater strategy, and ends up even articulating the strategy in a DR here, even coining the term floater, talking about floating to whoever is in power, being the first time I feel like the audience is made aware of this strategy. And again, this being the genuine version of a floater, not the misconception that got put on the term in later seasons, where this is a very effective strategy, especially when there are two sides to play off of. They can get them to come after each other, keeping you safe in the middle, but this is a strategy that is commonly looked down upon, even at the time, which I do think is part of what led to the misconstrued definition that we know of today, where even on this season, being a floater was looked at as you just skating by letting the better players take each other out, and that those that float are just these bad players that were able to sneak on through, not doing anything. And again, while there are examples of these style of players in future seasons, that isn't what a true floater is. Again, there's supposed to be this intentionality, this activeness in their ability to play both sides, and that's the type of floater that Allison and June end up being on this season. And with that, I guess we should talk about June's role in this week, which on the show, she doesn't actually get that much content, where that was really relegated to her mocking Erica's wardrobe and more of her relationship with G, where do you see them fighting, only for June to say that's good cover for their alliance. But this probably ends up being one of June's more active weeks in the game, where again, opposed to the June-Allison duo that this season gets remembered for, June actually spends a lot of this week trying to target Allison, with her actually playing this week pretty sloppily, where at this point in the game, I actually do think Allison was doing a more effective job at floating than June. Though that does start to change by the end of this week, where despite June's sloppy play here, she does end up putting a bigger target on Allison's back, while also taking Allison's spot in the game, placing herself in the middle, which does all start from June actually getting caught after attempting to get Nathan to come for Allison by leaking the fact that she jumped ship on him, only for this to eventually get back to Allison, leading to an argument between them that actually further turns Nate against June here, and ends up giving Nathan more ammunition in his attempt to stay, despite the fact that she wanted him out. Where that, along with the fact that she also ends up making this final four deal with herself, G, Erica, and Jack to target Justin the following week, a deal that does have a major impact on G's decision in the next HOH, even though that's not shown on the show. And again, that alone isn't bad for June, but what is her instantly ratting out that alliance to Justin, which in turn turns Justin against Jack, making him want to keep Nathan around, which all this is just really counterproductive for June's game, as this ends up leading to Nathan making a really late push to almost stay here, something that I don't think is talked about too much about Nathan, in which he was extremely close to surviving this round, despite the fact that he seemed dead in the water coming into it. Where with this new information, Nathan this time is able to successfully broker a deal with Justin to save him this week, under the pretense that Nathan would go after Allie in the following week. And what does end up stopping this plan from going through is June and G having to fight back against this plan, as at this point they wanted both Justin and Nathan out of the game as the two biggest threats. But even then, that isn't fully successful, as this only really makes them back down to the point where they decide to base who they vote out on what the next HOH is going to be, where if they had a sense that the next HOH would be a physical one, they would have kept Nathan around so that he can win it to keep them safe, which I do think he probably would have done for the short term, considering Nathan's not the type of person to make a deal and instantly go back on it. So for Justin, I actually do think it probably would have been the better move for him to keep around Nathan here, this big target in the game as well, though he does obviously end up backing down a bit here. Though again, for Nathan, it does seem to come down to chance here on what the following HOH is that determines whether or not he goes home here, which considering his starting point in this week, I think is pretty impressive for him. Though he does still end up going out in a unanimous vote here, and the actual eviction here ends up being pretty boring too, this being the first ever live vote for the season, which in old school Big Brother are largely boring considering they waste a lot of time here. But with that, we do lose Nathan, who again I think is a bit of an underrated player in the grand scheme of Big Brother, one that I think is largely remembered as this guy who was played by Allison, and while that is true, I do think that undermines the good work that he was able to do across this season. Where early on in the game, he did pretty effectively use his first HOH to position himself in the middle of the house. He again comes close to staying here, almost getting his biggest rival in the game to keep him around. So I do think there are good aspects to his game, though he is still a pretty naive figure in the game. But that aspect of his personality does end up making him the perfect victim for Allison that really ends up bolstering her legacy. Though I do think it's a shame that this is really all Nathan's really remembered for nowadays. But with that, we're moving on to week 6, which does start with an endurance HOH, which ends up being one of the more notable competitions from this season to me, where it ends up being a mostly basic comp of them standing in a cage, and whoever is the last to leave wins, with them continuously moving the smaller cages the less and less people are there, which ends up being a comp that would never be used nowadays considering how long this competition ended up going for. Though it does end up being a pretty classic comp to me, one that does have similar vibes to that of the pressure cooker and how long it ends up going here. And there are pretty big stakes for this competition as well, where here we do see most of the house being against the Stooges, planning to target them, and with Robert dropping almost instantly, it really leaves only G to fight for the Stooges. Though again, he had already been in talks to take out Justin the previous week, though the show doesn't show this. It does show him as a loyal number, but also I doubt he would have made the move himself if he had won, and I believe by the end of the week he actually wanted Robert out instead of Justin. Though again, he did start to dabble in playing both sides, which does play into his decision to drop out of the competition here, which leads to us seeing Allie throw it to Erica, giving her the HOH, which leaves us with pretty easy nominations here, with Justin and Robert going on the block, and we get Robert calling Erica a bitch for doing so, because that's Robert. Now, this week does end up being relatively light on character segments, but we do get a lot of focus on Erica and Robert, with them starting to finally repair their relationship and calling a truce, despite the fact that Robert targets her the following week. This week also has the demonic clam bake, which is a notable food comp to me, with this really OTT editing and Erica having to dress up as a devil for some reason. But also here we do have America's Choice for letters from home, and simply due to Robert having a daughter, Robert ends up winning here, which is funny considering like how hated he was by the online community back in the day, that he literally goes on to win every America's Choice here, and a lot of that seemed to be just because he had a daughter. Also here we do start to see Robert's annoyances with June, upset at how she's very obviously playing both sides, but this really ends up being the week in the game where June really starts to shine, fully embracing her floater role in the game, taking inspiration from seeing what Allison was doing, but just doing it better here. To where despite people's annoyances with her and constant talk across this week on the feeds about how June and Allison would be the worst possible final two, it is during this week that June ends up securing that she would beat Allison in a final two. Where through this and the previous week she had been working on her relationships with Erica and Jack, which in doing so ends up gaining her the favor of them to where she ends up securing those jury votes in that scenario. And Erica and Jack end up spreading this sentiment to Justin as well, which ends up making June the frontrunner to win in this scenario, a final two that became a practicality as well, with her and Allison end up forming a final two here. Which again, in this case, ends up being the best case scenario for the two of them, with them both likely not winning against anybody else and having the best chance on paper of beating each other, making this an interesting scenario where it is the optimal move for both members of this final two to get to the end together. Now, technically, I do think there could be an argument for Allison in particular that Robert might be someone that would be more beatable for her, though I do think considering the information that they had, this was the optimal route to take for the two of them. And this ends up being a really strange relationship as well, where the two of them seem to hate each other off the bat. While Allison starts to grow a liking towards June towards the end of the game, it ends up largely being a marriage of convenience here, which also ends up allowing them to mask this alliance, with no one suspecting that they would work together, considering how openly they hate each other, which really ends up being the MO for June across this season, considering her relationship with G as well, which also feels like an evolution of Big Brother strategy here, where last season Danielle and Jason really evolved the game through dominating through having a secret alliance, and June here is able to use the concept of secret alliances to secure herself in the game, with her now landing in a really strong position here with 2 secret final 2 deals, and also a deal with Erica and Jack that makes her the clear frontrunner by this point in the game, where she shouldn't face any adversity in getting herself towards the end game, with her on the path to her optimal final 2 against Allison. And even beyond that, I do feel like this is also a week where she starts to gain some respect from winning competitions as well, where she wins the veto this week. Though to be fair, Allie and G were both throwing the competition in positions where they probably would have beaten her, but still, I do think this is another point for her resume, and also this ends up securing that Justin's finally going home here after weeks of him being the main target for the majority of the house, and considering that fact, it's pretty impressive he made it this far to begin with, and losing Justin here, I mean, it just feels right. I mean, Justin is this really generic athletic guy with okay strategic ability that obviously gets taken out around the middle portions of the game for being this all-around threat, but really he just feels like a type of character we see on a lot of seasons, and from a pure entertainment standpoint, he really just does not bring much to the table, with him largely just being boring, and mixing that with the fact that he does say some icky things at points, which I mean really is most of this cast, but it really doesn't make him the most likable figure here. And really the most interesting thing about him on this season is the fact that he obviously comes into this game largely disadvantaged due to being an ex, and had to constantly dodge bullets in the game. Though even beyond that, I do feel like he just comes off as a pretty baseline player, where he doesn't really excel in any specific aspect of the game, though he does have decent moments here and there, largely stemming from his relationship with Dana and also Robert and G, but outside of that, I really just did not find him to be a good casting choice here. But now let's move on to week 7, which this and the following week end up being really strangely structured weeks, with them having the vetoes being played before the nominations for some reason, which I never personally like that structure as a whole. While it is a shakeup to the standard formula, it is also one that I think is bad. I mean, it's one that didn't need to be shaken up. I mean, it allows for nominations to be made with the knowledge of who has the veto, which really just makes the initial noms pretty superfluous, but also ends up leading to the pacing of these rounds feeling a bit off. Though to be fair, this is also the point in the season where the season just as a whole starts to crawl. But obviously we do start this round off with the HOH, which ends up being the standard carnival game that G ends up winning, being the first 2-time HOH of the season, and an HOH that really starts G's downfall here, where it is during this week that G starts to get this really massive ego, thinking that he has the game won for some reason. And through his series of wins here, he starts to look like more and more of a threat as the week goes on, to the point where June ends up dropping him and plans on targeting him by the end of the week. And mixing that with the fact that he's also blindsided by the eventual vote, he really ends up coming out of this week being primed to be the next week's target. With G winning the HOH, Erica and Jack instantly know that they're going up, though strangely because of this structure, the noms don't end up happening until the second episode of this week, as we do get the veto competition in the first episode, a veto that ends up being the return of the dilemma that we had seen Julie give to players in the previous 2 seasons, that have had her offering each player to put everyone else in the house on PB&J to get the reward. And in previous seasons this was a luxury comp, but here it's used for the veto, which I don't love. I think it's an interesting one-off here, the one that just largely comes off as kind of lame, and a lot of that also has to do with the decisions that were made for this comp that are extremely questionable, where it turns out that no one ends up taking any of the offers outside of G, meaning that G, again the current HOH, puts the entire house on PB&J for the week for a veto he doesn't even need. Where really from his perspective, it's like, who cares between Erica and Jack on which one of them goes home? Neither of them were going to work with him anyway, but also it just adds more to his resume of another comp that he's won, while also pissing off the rest of the house in the process. There really is no true benefit to this from G's perspective, but also beyond that, it's mind-blowing that neither Jack or Erica end up taking any of these deals either, in a position where they know that they're going up, and if the other had won the veto, then they would have been screwed. And I get that they both thought that they were safe at this point, but insane that neither of them went for this deal either. But either way, the veto winner here is technically not revealed right away, with them saving that for after nominations, though it becomes extremely obvious who had won it after like 2 seconds of the players talking. Well, here we do get a pretty humorous moment of Robert instantly freaking out over having to do PB&J again, and we do see Robert ranting to G, not knowing that he had won it, saying that you might as well put me on the block, seeming to want to go home. But then we get G admitting to him that he took the deal, and at that point Robert gets excited about it and later gets upset at June for trying to make G feel bad for taking the deal, which is all just a funny turnaround there. But also to add to G's issues across this week, we do also see G telling the others that he will agree to not eat as well, only for him to then sneak off with food in the middle of the night, with everyone knowing he's doing so, which is obviously a bad look there, as well as another dumb decision from G, where we do also get a luxury comp this week, where Marcellus ends up hosting the competition, with him weirdly sneaking around the backyard to hide gnomes. But the reward here ends up being another fast food sponsor here, in them getting McDonald's every day. And you would think that G being the only one allowed to eat food and having just taken food away from the other players would end up throwing this competition to pay it back to the others and also help his in-game perception, but no, he decides to win this competition too. Really just an idiotic decision from him. But to be honest, we also get a series of weird segments this week from the likes of Jack talking about the Kennedy assassination to this weird double eviction fake out only for it to turn out it's the tortoises leaving, to a random shopping spree that they're given after having to do a ceremony of them burning a piece of their clothing picked by another player, which that segment in particular goes on for a while. But as for the vote, again, I didn't think it really mattered too much for the Stooges on who goes here, though they do really set their eyes on Erica, because why not try that again, I guess? And we do see them thinking that the vote is locked in, as they did last time, with G even sharing his McDonald's first with Jack, thinking that he's gonna leave him weakened for the next HOH. This is where we do see the Girl Power Alliance come together, obviously comprising of the 3 women left in the game, which it's nice to see a somewhat successful women's alliance in Big Brother here, which in turn secures the votes onto Jack instead. And strangely, through this round, Allison ends up being set up as the swing vote here, where for some reason the Stooges start to trust Allison more than June in this position, which is good for her on paper, though I do think this actually ends up backfiring on her. Their eventual flip on them in this round being looked at a bit more negatively from the Stooges, with her having backstabbed them more recently than June, but also further gives off this persona of her being this indecisive, wishy-washy player, which I do feel like this aspect of her jury management is the main contributor to her eventual loss. Though with this move, this actually ends up positioning Allie pretty well in the game moving forward, with both Erica and June taking her to the end over each other, though the problem is that she loses to both of them. While at the same time, I do question this move for June, where through June losing Jack here and also later taking out G, she ends up getting herself into the end game, where only Allison would consider taking her to the end, with her slowly taking out these figures she has closer relationships with. And while I understand her reasoning for doing so, especially considering they are some of the bigger jury threats on the board, I do think it was probably suboptimal play for her to reach the end game with the likes of Robert and Erica, who weren't particularly likely to take her to the end. But either way, this week does obviously culminate in this great blindside of the Stooges, with Erica being saved here, meaning we lose Jack, who, again, I found to be a really likable presence on this season. Clearly one of the least unlikable figures on this very unlikable cast, but also one that just isn't the greatest player in the world, being largely aloof of what is going on for a majority of the game, having a bevy of incorrect reads on the game, and also being largely ineffective in the game. But I always found him to be a pretty unique character here, being the older guy in the cast, but still being one of the more game-centric players in the house, despite being wrong a lot. And Jack's a player I would have liked to see play again back in the day, though obviously it feels like a casting choice that just wouldn't be on modern Big Brother. I mean, outside of him really hamming up the FBI persona, though Though really, I feel like he's a casting choice that feels of his time. Now for week 8, where again, from this point forward, the season really starts to slow down to a crawl here where somehow we still have 10 episodes left, despite the fact that we're down to the final 5 already. Though again, this week ends up having a different structure to normal, where in the previous eviction episode, they kept on promoting this as someone else will be removed from the Big Brother house tonight, leading us into the HOH comp, where here we see a comp that ends up being pretty commonplace in modern Big Brother, of these items going missing around the house and the players having to do a Q&A on those specific items. And we do get some humor here from G and Robert noticing these items missing first, but then having trusted Allison at the time, they end up telling her about it, leading to her telling the other women, who then end up outstudying Robert here anyway, leading to June winning her only HOH comp here. But with that, that's when we get the reveal of the twist, that June has now also won a reward. That being her being flown out to New York City, where she will be a special guest at the MTV Video Music Awards, which is obviously a cool reward here, obviously being a once-in-a-lifetime experience, but one that does feel extremely random to be adding here. But even beyond that, this could have also had some negative game ramifications. Now it doesn't, and nothing really ends up changing here, but here we do see June coming back to the house, talking about her interactions with fans that she had along the way, which, considering the amount of work that production went through in creating a sequestered jury for this season to limit the amount of outside influence tainting the game, for them to just loosely let June out of the house here and having fans come up to her to where they literally could have just said anything, ends up being pretty asinine of production here. But because she is away here, we do end up getting the entire first episode of the week without June, which is where we do get a noticeable icky moment for the season, in that Robert, being upset by the Jack blindside, ends up going on this massive rant about the women in the house, saying that it's not fair that evil girls get to do what they do. He says that they should have taken all those bitches out, which, I mean, he couldn't have even if he tried. He says the more evil you are in this game, the better you'll do, and says that we're not meant for this game, but those whores are, saying that they're 3 sluts who don't deserve it. Again, all this being really terrible. I mean, really just showing you how unlikable Robert is here. Yet for some reason, he was still somewhat liked by the casual audience. Also here we get the reveal of an interesting move here from Erica, of all people, where on Jack's way out, she ends up telling him that she was saved because of the guys threatening Allison, which, while I don't think it has much of an actual impact, I do think it is a pretty savvy move from Erica here in portraying the Stooges in a bad light here, in the case that she ends up in the end with them, while also showing Allison as, again, playing this game more emotionally, which would help her in her planned final 2 of getting to the end with Allison. So while a minor move, I do think this was a play that kind of felt like a smaller scaled version of what we would later see from the likes of Nicole Franzel and Josh and Paris, in sending these jury members into the jury house with specific information in order to try to change the jury perception. But after the reveal that June isn't coming back from the DR, we do get the reveal of clues to June's location, which is where we get the reveal that this is the veto comp, where the first person to answer correctly about June's location wins the veto. Again, in a position where this is done before the nominations once again, and we even get the veto results being officially revealed before said nominations as well. But also an added twist here, June obviously can't play in this comp, but she will be rewarded the veto in the situation where no one gets the answer right. And as a whole, I don't like this competition, where in later seasons they end up using this as a luxury comp, and I feel like in that situation it's completely fine. But here, as a competition that actually has direct game ramifications, I do feel like it's underwhelming in the fact that these are all clues leading up to you having to figure out the VMAs, which would obviously require a decent chunk of pop culture knowledge. That just felt like a lame way to determine a very important veto here, especially for G, who really needed this win, and to see him be dead to rights right at the beginning of this week just because he didn't know the iconography that related to the VMAs is a pretty lame way to go out here. But I will say that I do think we got a couple good character moments along the way from this, particularly from Erica, who has this Heidi-like moment of her saying that seeing the missing poster made her know that she was missing. But also we have her asking where Monday Night Football starts, only for Allison to humorously respond with, "It starts everywhere." But Allison ends up being the one to win the veto here, and the rest of the gameplay of this week is largely uninteresting, where after June returns, we do obviously have her targeting G, though throwing up Allison against him, obviously knowing that she's going to use the veto on herself, and in turn protecting June from some potential crazy plan of Allison flipping on her and saving G. And for some reason here, we do get a live veto ceremony right before the actual eviction, which again leads to very little movement happening in the game throughout most of this week, though they try to add this fake suspense of Allison possibly not using the veto, as she doesn't want Robert to go on the block for some reason. But again, this obviously doesn't go through, but this week does end up showing us Allison doing a lot of work on Erica, securing that Erica will take her to the end by acting really emotional to Erica about being upset that someone as terrible as June could win this game, which again, I do think Allison's tactics of using her emotions to pull on others' heartstrings do end up backfiring on her in this game, with other people just looking at her as an emotional figure that constantly flip-flops on her decisions. But again, a lot of this week really comes off as filler, with segments like them being given cameras to make a home movie to parody the evicted players and the jury. We also get a segment about how Robert lies about knowing a lot of celebrities, which again, the evil dick comparisons here are really uncanny. But either way, the week ends with a unanimous G vote, and G is someone I've always liked on this season. While he may not be the most riveting TV and definitely demonstrated some major holes in his game, he really just felt like a different character from what you would typically see on old school Big Brother, coming from a different background than most of the other players at the time, but also ending up having a pretty interesting run on this season, coming in a bad position and ends up being blindsided in week 2, only for him to pick up the pieces pretty well, learning the game, and ends up playing the next most active game after June and Allison, though again really just peaked a bit too soon before the end, and in general just showed a lot of naivety that caused his eventual downfall, though still ends up being a pretty large presence on this season and ends up being one of the season's better players. But with that, let's move on to week 9, where again we get an entire week for the final 9 round, which clearly leads to a lot of filler with segments like pinata making and Allie killing bugs. We also get this weird segment of Allison telling this story about how she almost died when she was young, only for no one to end up believing her story. This and the following week also do end up containing a lot of Robert bashing from June and Allison that really does get pretty icky, with them bringing in his daughter into it as well, which does obviously feel very mean-spirited and does play into the more negative tone that I remember this season for, despite the fact that these comments don't even actually make it to the show, though all this was propelled by there being an America's Choice this week, with Robert winning once again, with him getting a call from his daughter, which is a really emotional moment that again ends up being one of the few scenes on the show that displays Robert in a positive light, which is a pretty emotional moment. Again, nice to see this father-daughter reunion, though again, still strange to be seeing Robert in a positive light here. But from a results perspective, this week does play out in a pretty optimal way, where Robert ends up somehow winning the HOH here in a pretty humorous fashion, with it being a tiebreaker between him and Erica, with Robert being way off, but Erica ends up being 6 over, which really has Robert stumbling his way into a win here. And well, yes, it is underwhelming that this does strip us of what could have been an iconic final 3 of this successful women's alliance. It does end up leading to Allison and June finally facing some adversity as a duo here, with Robert ending up putting him on a block, seemingly as an entirely emotional move of him not respecting how Allison and June played the game and wanting to make sure they don't win, which, what do you know, another thing Robert fails at in this season. But during this week, we do see Robert and Erica seeming to fully repair their relationship, with Robert now intending to take her to the end, though through doing so, this ironically ends up furthering the bond between June and Allison, with them being able to bash Erica behind her back. And we do get some awkwardness this week from Allison and June wanting to stay away from Erica, with there being a luxury comp for a blimp ride, which was funny that no one wanted this, though we do see June and Allison winning it just so they can avoid spending alone time with Erica. And also here we get this weird scene of Erica trying to talk game with June in the middle of the night, only for Allison to interrupt them and sitting down in the middle of the room, leading to them just staying there for minutes not talking, which is just really awkward. But despite Robert and Erica seeming to work together at this point, they weren't even on the same page, with Robert wanting Allison out as a bigger comp threat, though really he has no say here anyway, as Erica is the only person that would have been able to vote, and she had a much closer relationship to Allison at this point. That leads to her wanting June out instead, which really this endgame ends up being the only time that June ends up actually being in danger, where with there being no more sides to play off of and Allison actually being better positioned in the game at this point, though obviously having less win equity in that, it is Allison's loyalty to June and her overall comp ability that really ends up keeping June as the front runner to win, despite the fact that Allison's the only one that would take her to the end, giving her this pretty smooth path to the end, despite the fact that she's not even that well positioned. Though even here, we do end up seeing Robert calling June the smartest player of the two, which again, I do think really just shows you how June was perceived by the jury, where the BB4 jury commonly gets called out as being a bitter jury, which I've never personally subscribed to that, as at the time that they were voting, outside of Dana, I don't feel like any of the jurors were actively voting against Allison, but many of them were actively voting for June. Where while these two were both extremely hated by the jury, they at least did respect June as a player, looking at her as the more strategic one of the two here, while Allie was looked at as the more emotional one. Which Allie ends up doing a really terrible job at trying to counter that perception, explicitly saying in the DR that she's using her brain, but they don't think she is, and that's what puts her in a good position, but again, not seeming to realize that this is exactly the reason why they don't respect her in the game. And the way that she handles her in-game decisions here don't end up boosting her perception either, where we do get the final veto of the season, the first ever Final Four veto, after not having won the previous season, seemingly due to them thinking it was too overpowered at the time. And again, being in a position here where June probably goes home if that format wasn't changed there. Though it is a welcome change that adds more complexity to this final round, though the power of the Final Four veto is probably a bit overpowered in reality, where it really makes that competition the make or break of this Final Four round, with the Final Four HOH essentially just acting as immunity. Though to be fair, if you did take out the Final Four veto, you can say the same thing about the Final Four HOH being so overpowered. So really no matter what, I mean, competitions just end up being naturally more integral to the end game of Big Brother here. So again, just no matter what, competition wins do naturally become a lot more integral to the end game of Big Brother here, but they do, for some reason, end up naming the Final Four veto here to Diamond Power Veto, obviously a branding that ends up being used on a different type of veto later on. But here the comp ends up being a pretty easy one of making a staircase using the names of both nominees for every week, and we do see Allison winning the veto here, obviously putting her in a pretty bad spot now, where she does have to betray one of her final two deals, and does a pretty bad job across this week in maintaining Erica's jury vote along the way, again building up how horned she is to where Erica ends up seeing her vote off as more of June tricking Allison to keeping her than Allison doing what's in her best interest. But also, Allie just continues to lie to her unnecessarily across this week, never telling Erica that she's going home, in a position where there's really no benefit in doing so. She's really just delaying the inevitable and also making the eventual vote off even more hurtful for Erica in how she's just continuously lying to her, though in the process she ends up blindsiding Robert as well. And we do get this pretty great moment of Allison being really emotional during the vote, only for her to say in the following episode that it was all acting. But with that, we lose Erica, and Erica ends up being largely just fine on this season. I mean, she does come off as really unlikable back in week 2 with her racist comments towards G, though really outside that, she comes off pleasant enough of a figure on the show. The one that doesn't end up being too notable, where I do feel like if it wasn't for her return on All Stars, she would have been completely forgotten about in the modern day. And really her casting on All Stars is a pretty questionable one in that, where while she isn't necessarily a bad choice for a returnee, when you have the likes of Lisa, a former winner, or characters like Dana, Yvette, and Monica, the fact that Erica got a slot over them does feel weird, as she really doesn't do much of note on this season. Though, in comparison to June, Allison, and Robert, she does feel like the least unlikable of that bunch. That also ends up bringing less entertainment than them as well. But with that, we then move on to week 10, which again takes up the entire final 3 rounds for some reason. But here we do get the standard 3-part final HOH, with Allison winning the first endurance part, Though here we do see Robert trying to make a deal with Allison, saying that he's going to take her to the end, which again was genuine. I do believe Robert would have taken her to the end if he did win final HOH here, which in turn makes this another danger point for June, though really none of that ends up mattering as June wins part 2 anyway, which essentially is just game over at this point, with June having essentially just won the game with that one competition, as Robert can't win HOH at this point to vote her out, and Allison's obviously going to take her, who she will then end up beating. But we once again have Allison having some really wonky play here in how she handles her deal with Robert by saying that she is 99% sure she's going to take Robert, which obviously again, like, she can't deny this deal, as that would obviously potentially lead to Robert making a deal with June instead. But I do feel like the way that she leads Robert on throughout this week again makes it come off as she's extremely torn and that she ends up making this decision emotionally. Now, while I did say that I do think it's ridiculous that we get an entire week for a final 3 round here, this week does actually end up containing one of the more memorable, humorous moments of the season for me, and that being the appearance of the mime, where for some reason we have a mime entering the house and spending the day with the players, to where Allison just ends up hating the mime, and the mime ends up making a mess in the house, which all leads up to a reward challenge for a screening of Runaway Jury, which is a movie that I haven't heard anyone talk about outside the context of Big Brother. But here we see Robert winning it and taking Allison with him, leaving June by herself until the mime ends up returning to the house to mess with Allison's things, which is pretty funny. But also here we do get another America's Choice that Robert ends up winning once again, but this time it's just a live internet chat, though it is pretty funny here to see Robert being called out for his comments about women, which I should also mention that Julie also ended up questioning him about that during the previous eviction episode, which again is still weird that he wins fan favorite votes like this despite that. But coming into the final part of the HOH, we do get some humor from Robert, again thinking that he has more sway than he actually does, where he then threatens both Allison and June with jury votes, saying that he's going to turn the jury against them if they vote him out, which again, he has no power to do so, and he instead ends up being the one that gets his mind changed by the jury later on. But again, I do think Allison's reaction to this is also pretty bad, where she does end up using this as an excuse for why she votes out Robert, thinking it would make Robert less bitter at her for making it seem like Robert's fault for his elimination, though it just ends up making her look like a more emotional player here, making it look like she voted out Robert because she's upset at him. But the final HOH here ends up being a pretty interesting one, with both June and Allison not really wanting to win it, as they obviously don't want to be the one to burn Robert's jury vote. And it does end up being a weird comp of them having to answer questions about their relationship with their exes, which I don't particularly like, as this obviously means that the answers are radically different for the two players involved, adding a level of variance here. Though I also found it funny to see Allison generally getting some of these questions wrong and actually being hurt by what Justin says about her, all while June is actively getting her questions wrong here. But it all culminates in a pretty fun tiebreaker in which both players are throwing it, though June throws it better by putting 1 million while Allison puts 0, leading to Allison winning here and being the one to cut Robert, in a position where, again, while going against June on paper is a better move for Allison, as they are the two perceived jury goats, I actually do think her chances against Robert were probably better, even though that still probably leads to a loss, where Robert would obviously have the Stooges, Dana, and then maybe Erica and Jack, though I do think those two votes would have been bigger swings in that scenario than it is against June. But when Robert leaves here, we do end up having them bring out his daughter so they can milk everything they can out of that relationship, which again also kind of goes against the point of sequestering the jury, but either way, still a nice moment there. But with that, we do lose Robert, who again is a largely unlikable presence on this season, being really overconfident and being openly misogynistic, yet despite that was still somewhat liked by the casual audience, just due to having a daughter, I guess. And really he comes off as a pretty bad player here as well, really getting lucky in the way that he stumbles his way to the end, with his allies coming off as bigger threats than him, and Robert doing nothing actively to get into that position, along with the fact that he really just stumbles into a almost winning position here, where he likely wins against Allison and June, though, to be fair, that's not a guarantee. But again, I do feel like Robert is a player that gets to that position by just blindly following the other Stooges and actually being the least threatening of the bunch. And with him also being really unlikable as well, I just really never found Robert to be someone I personally enjoyed watching on the show, despite his doofusy portrayal at points. But then we get to week 11, an entire week for the final two, which is really dumb here, though obviously you can blame that on Scott's ejection. But here we do get a pointless penultimate episode that acts as this pseudo clip show that also ends up including footage from the jury house, but also has us getting the reaction to the Robert eviction, with June just ripping into him while Allison feels bad for voting him out, which is a fun dichotomy. But then we get to the finale where we do get to see the jury really disdaining both of them for being floaters and also for making personal attacks, despite the fact they haven't seen the worst of it yet. But at the same time, you can also tell how they do respect June's game more than Allison's here, with Erica saying that June got Allison to do her dirty work, and here where you see G campaigning for June, which that along with Jack and Erica's support of her and also Dana's anti-Allison sentiment, it does all but amount to an easy win for June here, with even Robert, who came in hating June and not wanting to vote for her, ends up having his mind switched by the end of this. But obviously we do get jury questions here, which I actually feel like Allison performs solid enough here, admitting to lying more than necessary and highlighting her strategic thinking throughout the game, seeming to own her game, though again it was just a bit too late for that here. All while June has a pretty lackluster performance, talking about taking out Jack because he was throwing comps, which was a bad read from her. She ends up calling her game more honest and honorable, which felt pretty high horsey. And then we also get her talking about her personal attacks, to where she doesn't take responsibility for them and just says that she thought that they were funny, to where even after the jury questioning, we see June being confused over why everyone was so upset at the personal attacks that she made. And this leads up to the jury voting, which is done in a bit of an interesting way here, a way that I wish returned, in which the jurors vote before the finale, which allows them to then watch the entire season before the eventual reunion, allowing us to see their reactions to the show, which on this season in particular ends up upsetting the jury even more, which is funny considering that they were already really upset at both June and Allison. But the hatred that stems from this also leads to a lot of awkwardness later on that I do think is the main reason why they don't do this anymore. But here we do get a pre-taped reunion segment, which again, I did like. I liked how they were able to talk about the actual show, which was obviously a unique aspect of it, where we do see G calling out Erica for her previous comments, along with Dana also calling out Jack for his buzzard's crotch comment, which is just kind of dumb. Well, this all leads up to the winner reveal, where for the final time, we do have the evicted players entering the house to reveal their votes one by one. A format that I do like on paper, though this shows the downsides of that format, where it ends up being an extremely awkward segment here, especially with Allison and June not knowing they had seen the tapes, which makes them confused over why they're being treated this negatively. Which through the awkwardness here and how unstructured of a segment this feels, I do get why they changed this for BB5 On, to have Julie read the votes instead, though at the same time I do miss this more raw format of letting the players say their piece as they cast their votes, where we do see Dana saying that she's lost respect for the two of them, and we have G getting on a bit of a high horse and saying he couldn't sacrifice his respect for others. Though also here we do get the likes of Jack calling June the smartest player in the house. And we also have Erica giving June the credit for being the one to get her out of the house. All leading up to June winning in a 6-1 vote here, getting every vote but Nathan's, to where even Nathan ends up voicing his disappointment in Allie when he reads his vote. Though again, this just ends up being a really awkward winner reveal, with no one really being happy here. I mean, June and Allison are both clearly uncomfortable, while the juries clearly just don't want to be there voting for one of these two. Though we do end the season similarly to previous seasons of the two going out to see their loved ones, and we do get this awkward interview with Julie to wrap everything up. We do get interesting moments here, like Donnie somehow not having broken up with Allison, leading to them going on The Amazing Race. While we also get some awkwardness from Allison, saying that the person that she'll be friends with after the show is June, while June just ends up saying Jack instead, which again shows you how June looked at their relationship. But either way, a really memorable conclusion to the season here, though one that can be really cringy over how awkward a lot of this comes off as, though the rawness of the emotions from everyone involved here does make this one of my personal favorite finales in BB history. But with that, let's wrap up the video by talking about the final two players, starting off with Allison, who to me ends up being one of the more complex characters of this season and possibly in Big Brother history, where despite being portrayed as a very cutthroat player for the majority of her run here, she also does have an extremely emotional side to her as well, to where she seems to be largely conflicted between these sides for a lot of the season, where she's probably the most effective player at playing the flirt card, especially at this point in Big Brother, and probably is the most iconic of them all while having a boyfriend back at home that she constantly cheats on, that she claims to still care about, despite her seeming ambivalent towards him at points. But that doesn't take away how effective she is during most of this season. I mean, the way that she manipulates Nate throughout the early parts of the season is really impressive. I mean, the way that she floats between the two sides after the Nate eviction and positions herself to where she's almost guaranteed to make it to the end by the time of the end game is impressive work as well. The problem is obviously her jury management. And not because she is this super cutthroat player that eliminated her allies, but mainly because she wouldn't own that. She played this strategy of being this emotional, naive girl to the point where everyone started to believe that that was actually who she was. And through that, they were able to paint all of her gameplay moves as extremely emotional moves. I mean, really, the jury ends up not voting for Allison here, not because they dislike her more than June, which I don't think is the case for around half the jury, but really because they don't respect her game. Because she was always looked at as playing an emotional game, which I do think is a shame, because I do think there are aspects of Allison's game that I do think are more impressive than June's. But just in terms of how she portrayed that to the jury, she was deeply flawed in her overall approach, which ends up costing her the game here. But beyond that, she is still a very iconic character, one that gives these incredible DRs that make her one of the best confessionalists of all time, and one of the best characters in the history of Big Brother to me. But then we move on to the winner here in June, who, despite her flaws, I feel like is still a very solid winner of Big Brother, one that gets credited for the creation of the floater strategy, which again, I don't think is particularly fair, though I do think she ends up innovating upon it and ends up doing it the best in this season, to where she can largely take credit for the popularity of the strategy, where while I think Allison does a lot more impressive individual moves across this season, I think June does a much better job at managing her perception throughout the game, knowing when the right time to flip between sides was, unlike Allison, who seemed to be playing both sides for a bit too long, to the point where they start to lose respect for her through her doing so. And also June just manages her relationships within the game a lot better as well. She's also the most effective player in utilizing the X Factor twist to her benefit, with her relationship with G helping her navigate through the game, and also having G campaign for her on the jury due to how well she managed that relationship. Again, there's a lot of impressive play from June on this season that really ends up innovating upon the strategies that we've seen utilized by Will and Danielle Reyes in the past seasons, though she's not without her flaws. I mean, she obviously struggles winning a jury vote against most people in the game, with Allison being the only clear-cut win for her. Though to be fair, she did have a lot more active work in trying to get to that final two, though again, she does make personal attacks that do feel largely unnecessary and do harm her overall jury prospects. But that is also part of what makes her such a great character, where while yes, she does make some comments that do come off as very mean-spirited at points, I do feel like June, just like Allison, is another one of the better confessionalists in the history of Big Brother, with a lot of that coming from her really scathing remarks and how brilliantly she's able to mock the other players. Also, she's able to exude this confidence about her that somehow comes off as more entertaining than it does unlikable. And really, June ends up being a really iconic figure for the show, one that I'm really disappointed in the fact that we never got to see her play again. Though over her one season that she has here, she does do a really impressive job at both innovating upon the gameplay of the series, but also showcasing how great of a character she is as well. But there we go. I mean, that is the entire season of Big Brother 4. One that I do enjoy a lot more than I used to where despite its pretty dark tone overall, I do feel like there are some pretty great moments throughout it, evolving the game with the prevalence of the floater strategy, while also introducing us to two all-time great characters that really take the spotlight on this season. But beyond that, this season still has its issues. Again, it does have a mostly unlikable cast, which even has a few duds within it, has a boring format that has the endgame really stretched out, with not much truly going on there, and also a lot of focus on the X Factor twists, which largely comes off as really trashy even for the time, which these issues do make me struggle with placing it in the top half of Big Brother seasons for me, but it is certainly a season that I do have a level of reverence for now, in how it does feel like the steady progression of the series with it evolving the gameplay, despite the fact that it's not as iconic as seasons like Big Brothers 2 and 3. But with that, those are my thoughts on Big Brother 4 20 years after its initial airing. Now moving forward, like my other retrospectives, I will be doing a player ranking for this season down the road. Now also you can expect a Big Brother 5 retrospective in a similar vein at some point next year, and just in general expect similar content to this for the channel moving forward. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.